It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. You can find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting. If you reach out to me through my email, oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. And if you like our show, be sure to check out our Patreon, the Opperman Report Patreon. We got a lot of exclusive content up there. I got stuff coming out. I have exclusive audio of Charles Manson. About an hour and a half of it. It's never been heard anywhere before. He's singing poetry, all kind of content. You could find that up at the Opperman Report Patreon, along with my interview of Marlon Merling about his book about Manson. Great content there, so keep an eye out for that. Otherwise, you can find the show. I do a lot at Spreaker.com. We do a live show there Friday night. There's a chat room. You get an email notification when we put up new content. 4,000 hours of content over there at Spreaker.com. Plus, I play repeats every single day of the week. We have today Greg Tillman. He's a documentary director. He's just finished this film called Oklahoma City Bombing, American Terror. And it's coming out on Netflix April 18th. And if you go there right now, when you listen to the show, you can catch the trailer, too. Just went up on Netflix today as we're about to tape. Mr. Tillman, are you there?
I am, sir.
Hey, great, man. Hey, before we get into film here, Oklahoma City Bombing, American Terror on Netflix, tell us about yourself. Who is Greg Tillman?
Greg Tillman is a filmmaker who lives in Los Angeles and has been doing this in various ways for the last 25 years or so, as an editor, sometimes a writer, often a producer, and now directing.
Yeah, I was checking out your IMDb, but this seems to be your first documentary, right?
Well, I've directed a lot of things like reality stuff. Back in the day, I was doing Dirty Jobs and shows like that, and I've done some independent stuff on my own, but this is the first kind of big doc that I've worked on as a director. Yeah, I've done a lot of stuff with Tiller Russell, helping him either as an editor, a writer, or a producer, as he's directed shows like The 7-5 and Operation Odessa and Night Stalker, Hunt for Serial Killer, all that kind of stuff.
Oh, yeah, I love that Operation Odessa. I love that one, man. And also, to the Mike Dowd 75th Precinct he did. And that Waco film, too. I love that Waco film he did. Apocalypse, it was called, right?
Waco American Apocalypse, yeah.
Right.
I didn't actually work on the 7-5. That was like Tiller and a lot of people that we've worked with together. But I came in and helped him on Operation Odessa, and I think we're all really proud of that one.
Oh, yeah.
Came together.
That's a great story. Yeah, the coke smugglers trying to buy a submarine from the Russians, man. That's a great story. Okay.
Crazy, right? Crazy.
Yeah, I love it.
Can't make it up.
Yeah. Well, I guess you could if you really tried. Now, what was it about the Oklahoma City bombing story that caught your attention and inspired you to do this?
I was a producer on a series that Tiller did for Netflix called Waco American Apocalypse, as we just mentioned. 4-part series about how that whole thing went down back in 1993. And Arian Wu, an executive at Netflix, thought it would be an interesting thing to do a documentary about the bombing in Oklahoma City because it's kind of connected to Waco. You know, there's a lot of crossover. And she brought that to Tiller and asked him about it, and he was swamped with a bunch of other stuff. And he said, yeah, let's do it, but I think Greg should direct it.
Mm. And what was your goal? What kind of story are you trying to tell with this story here, American Oklahoma City bombing, American Terror?
You know, there were lots of different ways to tell a story like this, and we'll never finish. You know, it's one of those stories that can be told 1,000 different ways because it affected 1 million different people.
Yeah.
In the end, I think what our goal was for this show was because we didn't have 4 or 5 hours to do it in, we wanted to tell a kind of minute-by-minute retelling of the bombing and the aftermath as it happened. With people who were, as much as possible, sort of at the heart of the story, wherever it was really most intense in the first few days afterwards, and then through the trial of McVeigh and Terry Nichols.
Yeah, it definitely has that suspenseful, tense kind of the music and the pacing of the film. You're like at the edge of your seat watching, first of all, this tragedy, which I gotta admit, the way you captured the emotions and the people's personal experience, it was unique. But like I said, it's like this tense chase almost, to find, to track down the bomber and stuff like that, right?
Well, while it feels like a limitation when, all of a sudden, we don't have 4 hours like we did with Waco, tell the story. But in the same way, it's kind of a gift. It's like, okay, well, what are the most important moments in the story in the first few days and then afterwards? So you really are just left with, the high points, just one to the next kind of thing. And I think that's why it feels paced up and it really moves.
Was there anyone you wanted to film who didn't, you weren't able to get them to cooperate with the film?
No. We didn't go into it with any kind of preconceptions. It's kind of we just cast a wide net and started making phone calls and talked to people at the Memorial Museum in Oklahoma City who were very helpful, introduced us to a lot of people. And it really is just kind of a game of telephone at that point. We talk to one person and then they say, you know what, you should also speak to this person. And somebody in the FBI introduces us to another FBI agent who was there, and, someone who was a first responder talks to us about someone else. And after a while, we had way more people. We'd spoken to 5 times as many people as we could actually use in the show. We just didn't have room for it all. And that was the hardest part. There are about 8 people that we actually sat down and did long interviews with that aren't in the show just because we didn't have the real estate. And I continue to apologize to them in person and just thank them for their part in it, because even though we didn't use them, every person we spoke to gave me some information that I hadn't heard before that then informed the next interview that I did, and it's interesting to watch people that we interviewed throughout the process. There would be moments where I would say something that someone had told me in the last interview and they'd be surprised, something that they hadn't heard before. Everybody still it was such a chaotic moment in their lives and kind of America. Really, it was a global story, and there's just so much to know, and people keep learning about it.
And I guess it's such a small town too. And plus, people have gone through this shared trauma. They must have all known each other. And now these 8 folks who you couldn't, there was no room, the cutting room floor. What would they have contributed?
Well, before I answer that, which is a great question, I will say it is absolutely a shared trauma. I said to somebody recently, when I got out of the airport the first time I went out there to Oklahoma City, I started to have a conversation with a woman who worked in the booth at the car rental place at the airport. And for some reason, I just had to sit there for a minute, and we started talking, and she asked me what I was doing in Oklahoma City, and I told her, and she had a story. All of a sudden we were talking about her memory and her experience of that day. Everyone in that city who was alive and old enough to remember has a real visceral, intense memory of that thing. And I think it still bonds that town in a way that's unique.
Yeah. I lived in Vegas for October 1st, the Mandalay Bay shooting. And, when you live there, it's a whole different experience than watching this stuff on the news or on the internet and stuff like that. And one scene in particular from your film, when they were bringing the victims out, and there's a scene where they run out of gurneys, they run out of stretchers, and they're bringing this woman out on a chair, and they're carrying her out on a chair. And it just reminded me of the scenes in Vegas where the stagehands were saving people and bringing them out on these yellow plastic wheelbarrows to save the people and bring them over to where the ambulances were, because they wouldn't allow the ambulances to go to get that close to where the stage was, because they were afraid they were going to get shot, the firemen and stuff.
Amazing.
Right.
It's amazing too that the thing that I was most impressed with in this story, and it sounds like, it showed up there too, is something happens that's unimaginably horrible and incredibly dangerous and terrifying. And yet you see afterwards, after the cameras stop rolling, all these images of people who are actually running towards the danger. They're running into the heart of the mouth of the dragon to try to help people. It's amazing to me. And it's what kind of was most impacted me in doing this was to meet people who found this kind of hero inside of themselves that they may not have ever even known was there until they met and found some kind of challenge like this. And those stories just kind of kept popping up, and I was constantly impressed.
Yeah, that was definitely another thing that struck me too, because you have footage in there that we haven't seen, that the average person, unless you live there locally, I'm sure they played this stuff in the local news, but the average person hasn't seen these rescue up close the way you did. But what struck me was, you just imagine, they're running into this building that just blew up like 15 minutes ago, 20 minutes ago, and pancaked down. They're stepping on top of the 7th floor that's now on the 1st floor. It's a suicide mission to run into that building. Do you think they would allow first responders to run into that building today?
Well, I don't think there's a whole lot of rule following going on immediately afterwards. You know, everybody was making up their own, set of rules about what to do. Carl Spengler, who is the surgeon that we talked to, who hasn't spoken to many people and was just really generous with his time, and is one of those guys. He just comes off of a 15-hour rotation as a surgical resident at Oklahoma University. He's having breakfast, which he doesn't normally do, 5 blocks away from the building when it blows up, and he's with another guy who's like, I'm not doing that, and understandably so. It was another doctor who'd come off of a long rotation, was exhausted, and Carl just says, let's go. He's with I think she was a nurse, a young nurse who just started working with him. And, he's running towards the building a minute after it blows up. And when he gets there, it's quiet. It's like that moment in a restaurant when somebody drops a huge tray of plates, everything gets quiet for a second. He's there before all the chaos after the bombing really begins. And he told us a story that's not in there, where he looked up at the rubble pile in front of him, and he saw someone who looked like they were just asleep on the top of the pile. And at this point, a few minutes had gone by, and a couple of firemen had showed up, and he moved to go up onto that pile of rubble to see if he could help that person. And a fireman pulled him back, grabbed him, and said, you can't go up there. And he's like, what are you talking about? He's like, I got to go help that guy. He said, you step on that pile right now, and you'll be gone. In 30 seconds, you'll be dead. We'll never see you again. It hasn't settled yet. It hasn't stopped shifting. Things are still moving. And he was still ready to go up there, And sure enough, the guy that was on the top of the pile, even though he looked calm, he was already dead. And the fireman saved his life, Carl's life.
Now, wasn't there, toward the end, they described the little bio at the end. He retired shortly after that, PTSD, something like that?
No, he kept working for another 22 years, I think. He worked in Florida. He's an amazing guy. He's got a great story. He worked in Florida as an emergency surgeon, and also connected with a SWAT team and trained to work with those guys, and was a medic with a SWAT team for a while. And then he went to a Caribbean island and was the emergency surgeon in an island that should have been incredibly calm, he thought, when he got there. It turned out there were like 2 rival gangs on the island, and the hospital was right in the middle of the island. He said he saw more gunshot victims every night there than he would have maybe anywhere else. He's had a very interesting life. So now he's just kind of moved back to Tulsa, and he's selling real estate, and he's a competitive bodybuilder.
Oh, really?
Really interesting guy. Yeah.
So do you think maybe his experience that day kind of caused him to become like an adrenaline junkie and chase after that same kind of juice again?
I think that's a question you'd have to ask him. It's I think I'll tell you this: there's nobody we spoke to who was anywhere near this thing who I don't think is obviously wasn't affected by it, but is not still affected by it.
Yeah.
To some degree, everybody's still wrestling with it in some ways. And because it's just unimaginably horrible. People. Other shows are coming out about this story every year. It seems like somebody does something about this story. And some people are asking me, why do people keep making shows about this? And I'm like, I'm worried about the time when they don't. I hope they continue, because that'll mean that this continues to stand out as something exceptionally insane in American history. When they stop making documentaries about this story, it'll be because so much other craziness has happened that it doesn't surprise people anymore. And I hope that really never happens.
Yeah, I hear you. I've done other shows on this topic, and it seems a lot of people are caught up in the fascination with the conspiracy theories and John Doe #2 and all that kind of stuff. But you really captured the human impact, the trauma in these people's lives, which I consider I feel guilty myself for not taking that into consideration in past shows. How much. What a tragedy this was, man. Like the daycare center. Did any of those children survive in the daycare center?
I don't think. I'm trying to think if there was maybe one kid who made it out. Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't think so. It's those little punks. Most of them just didn't stand a chance. Yeah. They were just tiny little people. The daycare center was close to where the bomb went off. It was low in the building. And it was just, there was just kind of no hope. The museum does an amazing job of, like, if anybody's interested in this story and wants to know more about it in great detail, excuse me, the site of the building itself is now a reflection pool. Mm-hmm. And a building that was called the Journal Records Building across the street from where the building sat is now the museum. And they've done an amazing job. They really... I think just about every kid in Oklahoma goes through that museum, 5 times in their life at least. And they've got a publication that they put out, like it's a big thick magazine that they've got in the bookstore. And in it, they have a description of every single person that died that day, including all the kids. And you start to read through those bios, and you can't get through it, after a while, it becomes just an incredibly sad blur. But one thing that really strikes me when I look at those is they're all people who were really connected to other people. They were working in a profession that was out to help people. All the agencies in that building, HUD and Social Security. There are all these folks who are just, and then they're all volunteering for their churches, and they're working. They've got big families, and you got all these little kids who are in there, and they're the children of the people that work in the building or working, folks that work nearby, like Renee Moore, who's in the show. And you just like, what a hit, just so many good people doing good in the world, and all just taken out in a second.
Yeah, and when you think like all those little, like 100 and something babies, those little toddlers, and they all have aunts, uncles, brothers, sisters, parents. How many people are affected just by that one little group, that little daycare center? And then when you go on and see the rest of these people, the film opens up with old footage from 1995, which I'm 63 years old. Doesn't seem that long ago, but when you watched that home video with those old big computer monitors and the hairstyles and stuff like that, it was a different world back then.
It was a different world back then.
Yeah.
That's right.
No smartphones.
No smartphones. I mean, that's another level and a whole different kind of documentary that you could tell. I spoke to a guy who worked for the FBI who was in charge of logistics, and he was surprised to get the phone call. He's like, hey, nobody's ever called me about this ever. And I said, well, what happened? What was your job that day? And he goes, everything was out. There was nothing, no communications. So, and there was no way for us to communicate. There was no crosstalk between the police and the fire department and the FBI. And that was the most important thing at that point, was to get some control over the situation. So his job was to climb telephone poles and tap into lines as quickly as possible that might still be alive. And he said there were people who, when they picked up their phone for the first 10 hours after the bombing, they would hear the FBI talking to Washington, D.C. and talking to the fire department, because he just had to go, had to just cut into any line that he could possibly get his hands on. And then it was just all hands on deck to get radios and walkie-talkies and just anything they could find to just begin to communicate with each other. Yeah,
and the best man at my wedding was NYPD Harbor Aviation. scuba cop in New York, and he was part of the rescue. He was the rescue at the first Trade Center bombing with the helicopters when they plucked them off the roof one by one. But he was there at the second one too. And it's like a ragtag. You put together little ragtag teams of firemen and cops put together and just do what they can. Utter chaos. How did you get that footage though? The home video of the office and stuff like that. One of the people just said, "Hey, we have this at home."
I have an amazing archival producer. Her name is Caitlin Colford, and her job is to just dig in, And by the time we did interviews, we probably had, I don't know, half of the footage that's in the show already, So now I'm able to ask people questions about things that I've seen that happened that day and kind of remind them about things. And sometimes we'll even show them, a clip or two of something that we think they may have been involved in to kind of jog their memory. And so she's really amazing at making that happen and kind of having all that for us. But, it's that video at the start of the film was shot by Kim Burgess, and she didn't make it. It was video that she sent to her parents to show them, what her life was like working in the credit bureau there in the building. And she's actually in there for just a second. She gives the camera to somebody, and she's sitting behind a desk, and just another sweetheart who got wiped out.
Yeah, and the trauma these people must have gone through, you can only imagine. Especially that poor woman who was trapped in there, under the rubble, and they show her in the hospital bed. Then they show her later on. She looks much healthier today than she did back in the 90s. But just imagine that's one of my claustrophobic fears, to be trapped in rubble like that.
It's incredible that and the thing is, there weren't many people who, you'd think it's that kind of thing that sometimes, with a tragedy like this, like they send in the dogs and they get lucky and they find pockets where there are a lot of people and, that kind of thing. There just wasn't much of that at all. And that guy, Mike McPherson, who's amazing, who's a Oklahoma Police Department officer and bomb squad member. He described it, as you just said, like, the bomb blew 7 floors up. And so it sort of separated them from the building. And now, everybody's basically just floating in air for a split second, and then everything just falls out from underneath them. And it was so crazy. Some people talked about how someone who was sitting right next to them was suddenly gone, and they were still at their desk, with a cup of coffee in front of them that hadn't spilled. It was that clean of a cut, and it happened so fast. And if you were in the part of the building that did blow up and separate, and then, you really didn't stand much of a chance.
Oh, boy. We're talking to Greg Tillman. He's the director of Oklahoma City Bombing, American Terror. It's coming out April 18th. But the time you listen to this, you can check out Netflix. The trailers will be up there, and hopefully some of these things we're talking about will be up in the trailers. Now, some questions I have for you is McVeigh. Okay, I'm not clear on why did he get pulled over, and why was he arrested? Like, just because he had a gun on him? Aren't you allowed to have a gun in Oklahoma?
No, it wasn't. That's not why he got pulled over. Depending on who you believe, he says that I think he did a lot of revisionist history after he got caught. But the truth is, I think what happened was he just freaked out, and he forgot to put a license plate on the back of this speeder car, that he'd recently purchased. And so he's driving down the road, and fortunately, Charlie Hanger was like, a lot of people in law enforcement, anywhere within 1,000 miles of that explosion, they all wanted to go to the site. Everybody wanted to go down there. Scott Crabtree, who's an FBI agent that we interviewed who worked in Kansas, he absolutely wanted to head downtown to Oklahoma City. And they said, the guys at the FBI said, nope, hold on, just hang out there. We got a lot of people here. We'll call you if we need you. And the same thing happened with Hanger, who was an Oklahoma State trooper. He really wanted to head down there. And then somebody on the radio called him and said, you know what, stay where you are. We still need police out in the world. So just, keep your regular patrol. And then he turned around and headed kind of back towards where he'd come from. And then he passes this guy with a car doesn't have a license plate on it. And so that's why I lit him up, pulled him over. And we actually have, we made a deal with Lou Michel and Dan Herbeck. Lou was reporter for the Buffalo Times, and he's the guy that got the story. He's in the show, and he's the guy that after McVeigh was caught, he was able to connect with McVeigh's dad, and then eventually McVeigh said, yeah, okay, I'll let you interview me for a book. And he did about 75 hours of interview with McVeigh while he was in prison. So we had access to all of this audio with McVeigh that no one's ever heard before.
Right.
And, which is kind of an amazing thing. And we didn't want to go overboard and give this guy a platform. But at the same time, once some of our characters meet him, like Hanger, we thought it would work well then to start to hear this guy's voice. And it's not in there now, but we have audio, and we've heard audio of his point of view when he got pulled over. And he talks about how he's really full of bluster, throughout, all these interviews. And he talked about how, well, if he'd been a Fed, I probably would have shot him, but he was a state cop, so I, decided to let him live, kind of thing. Well, I'm not sure I'd buy it, but Hanger was on high alert. There had recently been a shooting of a police officer in Oklahoma. So he was careful with McVeigh that day just because of kind of, I think, that recent event. And he asked McVeigh to get out of the car, and he was still behind his door. He had McVeigh get out, walk towards him. And, still the only problem now is that McVeigh doesn't have a license plate on his car. But then as he starts to talk to McVeigh, and McVeigh reaches around behind himself to get his wallet out of his back pocket. He's wearing a windbreaker, and it pulls tight on his chest. And that's when Hanger sees the holster that McVeigh's got on, and he's got a 9mm. And that's when Hanger's like, he just reaches out and grabs that gun and says, "What's going on here?" And that's when McVeigh was about to get arrested. But he still, he got arrested. Nobody knows that he's the bomber. Not a clue. They're just taking him in because this guy driving without a license and carrying an unregistered weapon.
So he had no plate and no license?
He had a driver's license, but he didn't have a plate. Yeah. But that was enough, along with the weapon, to go in. And Hanger will tell you, and I think several people kind of mention it, that really he should have gotten out of jail the next day.
Right.
The way things work in small town America out there, he would have gone to see the judge the next day, $500 bail, come on back in a few months. And, and the next morning, I think the judge had something going on with his kid at school. So that was postponed, and one thing led to another. So he had to stay over for another night. And so now it was really luck, that he wasn't out there in the wind quickly.
That's a really small town. That's like Mayberry. The judge has to take his kid to school. I was going to ask you where you got that audio. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, Perry it's a beautiful little town. When I got there, I couldn't believe how it was like Mayberry. It's a town square, with a courthouse in the middle of it, and little businesses around the square, and a grain elevator, a block away next to the train tracks. I mean, it is, small town America at its best. Yeah.
Yeah, like you and me, like Vegas or L.A., cops see a car with no plate. Half the time they don't even stop them. Half the cars got no plates. But I was going to ask you, that was an interesting question, because I was wondering where you came up with that interview of McVeigh. I assumed it was a police interrogation, but there's someone out there that he had a project and they interviewed him, and they have audio interviews.
Yeah, Lou Michel and Dan Herbeck were writers for the Buffalo Times, and they did 75 hours of interviews with him, and they wrote a book called American Terrorist about McVeigh, kind of in his own words. And, so it's a real treasure trove.
Yeah. Where is that audio?
Amazing. What's that?
Where's the audio? They don't have it up on Patreon or something?
No, so far. Yeah, they're still hanging on to it. I mean, some of it's been heard in other shows and stuff a little bit, but I think we have more of it than anybody's ever heard before.
Then does McVeigh actually get into his motive for this?
He does. The motive that he wants people to think he had. We could spend days talking about who we think McVeigh is and what his psychological makeup was and all, and not get even close. I think he was a very sad, confused young man who really didn't understand people, didn't understand how to connect with other human beings, and had almost just did not have he didn't have any value for his own life, and he didn't have any value for other life as well. He was just a really unhappy person. Yeah. And an angry guy and lazy. He was lazy. He was a guy who wanted things to kind of come to him. And when he didn't get what he wanted, then he began just to get more and more angry. And I think this was an excuse for him to feel like he was important for a brief period of time.
All right, we're talking about him. All right. Oh, what about, how did he finance all this? How did he buy the fertilizer? How did he rent the truck? How did he get down to Waco and spend a few days down there? Who funded all this?
Well, they were living on the cheap. He'd take odd jobs. He worked as a security guard for a while after he got out of the military. He was in the military. He went to Desert Storm and fought, I guess the first Gulf War, Operation Desert Storm, and came back and wanted to be in Special Forces. And he'd been over there for, 8 or 9 months, not doing a lot of PT when you're out in the desert waiting to maybe fight. And he comes back and it takes him, 5 or 10 flights to get home, and he's exhausted. And a day or two later, they ask him, "Are you ready to, the 21-day Special Forces school kind of thing?" And he said, "Oh yeah, I got this." And he washed out the next day. Day 2, he blisters on a 5-mile march and just, I can't handle it. And after that, he was, I guess maybe 5 more months before he was out of the military. And after that, he was just kind of just almost homeless. He was a little car, and he was driving around the country. And like I said, he'd work as a security guard, and then he'd make a little bit of money, and then he'd get bored, and he started going to all the gun shows.
Right.
Across the country, and he'd sell camo gear and maybe a gun if he could get his hands on one, and started meeting people. And he'd been in love with the Turner Diaries, a book that he'd read even before he went into the military, and he would sell copies of that sometimes, and it was also a way for him to have conversations with people that he thought were like-minded. And, for anybody who doesn't know, the Turner Diaries is a book written by a guy named William Pierce, whose pseudonym was Andrew McDonald. And, it's absolutely horrible. It's, it's about a white American revolution that takes place in the future. And he says that he was attracted to that book and to the ideas in it because it was mostly about guns. But I think it's also, the racist elements were very, very interesting to him. So he was making money at the gun shows, and he was kind of just wherever he could pick up a little cash here and there. And then he met a guy named Roger Moore, who at the gun shows kind of took pity on him and said, you can have part of my table if you wanted to sell some of your stuff. And they got to know each other. And this guy had made a lot of money over the years, I think, building boats, like fiberglass boats that he sold to the Coast Guard and stuff. He'd been very successful. And his girlfriend invited McVeigh to come back to their place in Arkansas that was a big spread, a big chunk of land, animals and things. And he was a collector, and he had a ton of stuff in his house. He had jewels and gems and all kinds of guns and money, and McVeigh noted that. And they stayed in touch, and I think McVeigh visited him a couple more times. But when they got closer, when he and Nichols got closer to doing this, and they started talking about, well, we're going to need some real money, especially to buy things like, racing fuel that's expensive that they use in the building of the bomb, they decided to rob this guy that had been really kind to McVeigh. And McVeigh, being the real, coward that he is and was, told Terry Nichols, "I can't do it because he'll recognize me, even if I'm in disguise. So you go do it, and then we'll split the money and use it to finance our bombing campaign."
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, Robert. Yeah.
Nick Nichols went in and caught Moore when he was alone, tied him up, and just ransacked the place. I think he got something like 76 guns and a bunch of gems, uncut gems, and $3,000 in gold, which is probably a lot more gold than it sounds like now, because it was 30 years ago. And I think 1,000 ounces of silver. It was just like that. It was a big haul. And after that, they were set as far as money was concerned.
All right. What about now in these interviews? Was there did he admit to any kind of white supremacist or visiting these white supremacist camps? You hear those stories? Did he talk about that or admit to any of that?
I think what McVeigh did was he tried to connect with other people. He was pushing turn diaries on anybody who, at the end of a gun show, if he hadn't sold it, he'd just start giving it away. He wanted people to. He was looking for like-minded individuals. And, I think the thing that kept him from finding that group was that the internet wasn't around yet.
Right.
I mean, if he'd been operating during the time of the internet, I think there's very likely that he would have connected with a lot more people who would have been on the same page. But he was having a hard time, and he really didn't find it. And I think, the FBI will tell you that this was the biggest investigation that they ever did. Rick says it in the show, Bob Ricks, who was head of the response in Oklahoma City. And I mean, thousands of hours of interviews, and they did not come up with, this dark conspiracy that a lot of people want to believe in. I think that McVeigh had people along the way who were like, yeah, that sounds great, do that, who probably could have called the cops at some point, said, made a phone call to the FBI. His buddy Michael Fortier, who became the star witness in the trial, absolutely, even though he didn't help to build the bomb and he kind of stayed arm's length away from what was going on, he was involved in the lead up to the bombing. And at any time he could have picked up the phone and, said, stop this. But that's why I think McVeigh got away with it, was because there were so few people involved. Once you get a lot of folks talking about and planning something, all of a sudden you have the opportunity for somebody to talk about it, and the FBI will tell you, and I think I believe them, that they had a lot of people undercover in the country at that time in these militias and these organizations that people think may have been in on this. They had folks all over the place listening to what those guys were talking about, and nobody heard about this until it happened. And I think McVeigh got away with it because he was almost doing it by himself.
Yeah, and that crazy idea of renting the truck under his real name, like why wouldn't he had 3 guys? Why wouldn't they just hijack a truck? When you wait out in front, you see a couple out there, they're moving their, one apartment to another.
Well, he didn't.
Makes no sense.
He didn't rent it under his own name. He rented it under a pseudonym.
Oh, really? Okay.
Depending on who you believe, was either the name of somebody that was in his army, one of his army buddies, but his name was Robert Kling. And at one point in the audio that we heard from Lou Michel, McVeigh is like, yeah, I picked Kling because I like Star Trek and I like the Klingons because they're a warrior race. So I thought that was funny. And so he made a fake ID. Michael Fortier's wife helped him make a fake ID with Robert Kling on it. And what happened was when the FBI identified the truck axle, the axle for the truck that blew up, that carried the bomb, they were able to use the VIN number on that to trace it to the truck that took them to Junction City, a place in Junction City that had been, Elliott's Body Shop that had rented the truck. And that's when this guy, Scott Crabtree, who's an FBI agent, sitting out in the middle of nowhere in Kansas in an office that doesn't have any windows, he didn't even know about the bombing until several hours after it happened because he doesn't have the internet. He doesn't have a radio or a TV in his office. And he's a forensic accountant, really. He's just crunching numbers and trying to find things that people are doing with money that they shouldn't be. And he goes downstairs for a cup of coffee, looks up on a wall and sees, oh my God, this bombing, and he wanted to go to Oklahoma City. They told him not to. His bosses said, just stay put, and everybody in the world at that moment would have thought, this guy's never going to have anything to do with this. Sure enough, Elliott's Body Shop, he's the nearest FBI agent to that place in Kansas, and now he's off and running, and he goes in there and talks to these guys and gets the paperwork and gets a description of the guy that rented the truck. And it was the description and an amazing, likeness that was done by the FBI sketch artist. They then scoured the area. They had agents all over that Junction City area, like looking for anybody who'd seen this cat, And sure enough, there's a woman who runs a motel named Leah McGowan in that area, and she's like, yeah, I know that guy. And she's like, that's Tim McVeigh. And he, this guy uses a fake name to rent the truck, but he doesn't use a fake name to rent the room, the night before he rents the truck.
And he had the idea.
Now they've got it. Yeah. Now they've got a name. And what was really fortunate, they still don't know, they're like, well, we don't know. We don't have any proof that this guy is the guy, but we're starting to collect names of people that we're interested in. And those names are going up on a whiteboard in the temporary headquarters for the FBI back in Oklahoma City. And that's when an FBI agent named Walt Lamar, who is in the show, walks into that headquarters and looks up at that board and says, what are these names? And somebody tells him, and he's like, has anybody run these through the NCIC database? Right. Which is, man, you talk about old school technology, there's a giant room back in D.C. with computer tapes where all of the arrests in the country are being recorded onto tape. And you can find names of people, but these spools of tape have to go up onto a computer, and the computer has to click through every one of them. We kind of do a disservice to that moment in the film, I think, because, certainly to show that and how much time it takes would just be, wildly boring, because it took all night. It took like 14 hours, I think, before they got a hit. And the next morning, his name comes up as, hey, we got a Timothy McVeigh who's actually in custody in Perry, Oklahoma, 50 miles up the road. And now they're like, wow, we got to go talk to this guy.
Yeah, it's funny. Today they have these automatic license plate readers that every cop has in his car. They would know the track of that truck from the day it left the rental place until it got down there. They would have a whole map on that truck. And it's a whole different world, like you said. Quick question.
It's nice. It's kind of nice. Some of the things, some things are, a loss of privacy is kind of a drag sometimes, but a lot of these guys are, it's a lot harder to get away with what they could have gotten away with back then. Yeah.
Nichols, McVeigh, and Fortier, they were in the same unit in the military. Did they have any kind of special training? What kind of unit was that?
No, I think they were just basic grunts. He wound up as a tank gunner. The guy that operates the 44 millimeter, 40 millimeter. Somebody's going to give me a hard time about that, I guess. Gun on the top of the tank. That was McVeigh's thing, and he was good at it. He was the best gunner in his platoon, and but yeah, no, they were not. These were not Green Berets. These were just guys that
where did they get the training then?
Had nothing else to do.
Yeah, where did they get the training then to make these homemade bombs? These are sophisticated bombs at the time. This wasn't common knowledge.
Well, that's where the Turner Diaries comes in. Really, he's been reading this thing since before he goes in the military, and if you read that book, there's a description in there of how this revolution is set off, and it's exactly what McVeigh did. And the guy talks about how they make a plan, and they decide they're going to blow up the FBI building in Washington, D.C., and they're going to do it with an ammonium nitrate bomb. And he will say, McVeigh said several times, well, I didn't follow that book, but it was absolutely his blueprint.
And the thing about the call is the stuff about the calling card, because back then you could use calling cards to mask your home phone number. You just use it once or twice. You wouldn't use it continuously. But did he learn that from the Turner Diaries too, do you think? I
don't know. That's a good question. Yeah, it was the dumbest thing he did. that Nichols, they real evil geniuses thinking that they can mask all their telephone calls by, paying for a prepaid telephone card that, under somebody else's name. They used Daryl Bridges' name. And then they, but what it did was as soon as they found that in Nichols' house and were able to go back and access the records for that card, now they just have this unbelievable, it's an orgy of evidence at that point, just all the connections, all the different times that, a call has gone out, from the 40-year residence in Arizona to a place that sells ammonium nitrate to Nichols' place up in Decker, just all of it. And they were cooked at that point when they found that.
It's like a burner phone. If you use it once or twice, then it's effective. But if you got the same one, you use it every day, you might as well use a real phone. A couple of things now. John Doe number 2. What is your conclusion? You were in deep in this for a long time. How long were you working on this film?
Almost 2 years, year and a half.
Gotcha. So you're in deep with all this stuff. What is your conclusion on John Doe number 2?
Everybody we talked to said that, it's just a question of memory. That there were the people that worked at Elliott's Body Shop remembered 2 different people, and that guy had actually been in there the day before, and they eventually found a guy who fit his description. He's like, I'm just a normal guy who'd been there the day before, and memory's a weird thing, and which is why it's tough sometimes to trust witnesses on the stand, who were there kind of thing. But in the end, I think all of the FBI's, the folks that we talked to were like, yep, that was just a guy that wasn't even involved. And the people who were in the body shop, once they get excited and they start trying to remember everybody who's been in there in the last 48 hours. And that was the other guy that had been in there.
Gotcha.
The day before that they rented. Yeah.
Another thing, too, that you hear often repeated is the second bomb, the secondary bombing. At one point it was considered like a rumor, like there wasn't even a evacuation because of a second bomb. In your film, you have that fellow with the cowboy hat, and he says he saw this crate and he recognized it immediately as being a Laws rocket launcher. Correct?
Yep. Mike McPherson is a great guy. He's a member of the Oklahoma City Police Department and been in the bomb squad for a long time. And, this is back in the time when people were they were on high alert after the first World Trade Center bombing, and a lot of things were going on in the Middle East. And there was a real rush to judgment on this thing. Everybody thought that this was Middle Eastern terrorism. Somebody's come to the heartland with a bone to pick, and they've blown up our a building with all of our folks in it. And one of the techniques that they were seeing a lot in the Middle East was an important target is hit, and then as first responders flood into the scene to do real damage to the population that you're trying to hurt, a secondary bomb explodes that now kills police, fire, takes out people that are kind of essential to the response. So there was a concern that was going to happen here, and that Laws rocket was actually I think it was in the U.S. Customs Office. There were a lot of different agencies in there. There was ATF, and so there were things that they used in their day-to-day, and that was one of the things that it looked, for all intents and purposes, like a rocket launcher with a rocket. And apparently it was one of the things that they used when they were making deals with folks over in Mexico, gangs and anybody that they were trying to, it was one of the props that they used, like, hey, look, we can get you some of this. Are you interested? And it was a way to identify bad players and that kind of thing. And it's sitting there, in the rubble after the explosion. So for all these guys know this is just another bomb that is now about ready to go off. So even though that story, ends with a whimper in a sense, it's like, McPherson and the firemen go back into the building, everybody clears out, and these dudes walk right up on this thing that, for all they know is just going to blow them the kingdom come, and carefully get it out of the building, tie ropes around it so they can carry it and have it not hit anything, put it in a bomb pot on the back of the sheriff's department's bomb squad truck, and take it out in the desert and blow it up. But, now you've had this reaction where they had to clear the scene. They've had to call everybody out. Everybody go. So, everybody is on high alert. People are freaking out. They're racing away from the scene. People who, like Amy Downs, who are trapped in the rubble, all of a sudden, her rescuers are gone. And now she does not, for all she knows, another bomb is going to blow up while she's buried under the rubble. It was an amazingly dramatic moment that, even though it doesn't have it was based on a false assumption, which is that this was a live bomb. It's still incredible in terms of what it did to everyone in that moment, and it took people away from what they needed to be doing, which was taking care of people. Spengler has that amazing story where he says he's sitting there doing triage on folks that have been injured, and an Oklahoma police officer tells him to get out of there because he doesn't want him to get hurt. Right. And he's like, I'm not going anywhere. I got patients. Listen, I'm going to shoot you in the leg if you don't get out of here. And I think he may have meant it. It was a moment of real tension.
And this fellow with the cowboy hat, I think you said his name is McGregor. Am I correct?
McPherson. Mike McPherson.
McPherson. Yeah. Okay, so I'm really bad with names. Yep. I thought you were Tiller from Waco for quite a bit there. No, the other thing too is that he had the seniority, though. He had the seniority and the respect of this group that he could just see this crate at a distance and say, "Hey, that's a second bomb. Evacuate."
Well, it's one of those things where it shows you, like I said earlier, in the telling of the thing, I wanted to be able to, we were very lucky. We were really lucky to find people that were at different moments were kind of at the heart of the story, wherever the most intense part of the story was happening. So, Spengler is there, Dr. Spengler is there right after the bomb happens, and he's helping people making life and death decisions, minutes after the explosion. And obviously Amy is trapped, in the building itself. And Walt Lamar is an FBI agent. He doesn't need to go in there, but he does. He goes in there and he helps to get Amy out of there. And it keeps kind of, the story is thrown to people because it actually was thrown to people. When somebody saw this box that looked like another bomb, now everybody's like, well, who here is an expert? Who's the bomb squad guy from the local PD? And that's when Mike McPherson steps up and says, I got it. Let me take care of it. Yeah, that guy's a real hero. I mean, what guts to walk into a building an hour after it's, blown up to see if there's another bomb, that's going to do the same thing. Crazy.
Yeah, and I heard so many similar stories of chaos during 9/11, during the rescues there, where they thought that they were releasing gas through the streets and where the cops were staged, and they were evacuating that place. Just the kind of chaos and that goes on in these situations. So now back, though, to Greg Tillman.
This was a lot like 9/11, This was the 9/11 before 9/11. Yeah. It really was, yeah.
But back to Greg Tillman. Now, you worked on this for 2 years. How did it affect you? Do you think you had PTSD from dealing with this?
That's an interesting question. I'll tell you what, I've been able to, it's been amazing in that I've been able to connect with some people that I never would have. It's always what's amazing about documentary filmmaking, like getting to know Carl Spengler and, Renee Moore, who's amazing. And I think really is kind of the heart and soul of the show. She hasn't spoken to many people, and, she's a woman who lost her 6-month-old baby who was in the building. And, just the bravery of coming in. What's that?
I said we didn't talk about her at all. Yeah.
Amazing, amazing woman. She's like working down the street in the county courthouse as a bailiff, and, she just said goodbye to her kid that day, who stays in the daycare center in the federal building, just a block away. She's an incredibly brave person just to come in and talk about the story with me, and to kind of keep the memory of her little guy alive. And, there was just a lot of generosity with all the people that we talked to in the show. And like I said, I try not to dwell on the horror of it. I think it's important to keep thinking about this story because it really, especially now when the country is so divided in so many ways, it points to the kind of devastation that is inevitable when the kind of hatred and divisiveness that I think we're experiencing now is unchecked. You know, if you're really going to take your hate for somebody all the way to its limit, this is where it winds up with little kids, you know, in body bags.
And nothing accomplished. Nobody's mind was changed. Nobody followed McVeigh onto some kind of pro-gun revolution of white and racist supremacy. Nothing changed over this. You know? That's
right. I think actually, you know, the number of militias around the country, you know, there was a lot of anger back then. The assault weapons ban had just been signed by Clinton, and, you know, Waco had really, you know, made a lot of people think that the government's coming for your guns, and there was a lot. But after this, the number of militias around the country, I think, shrunk by half. I think a lot of people were just like, whoa, that's too crazy, you know? And they kind of, I think even if they didn't consciously recognize it, they recognize that this is not good for the country to have this kind of hate and to think that this is a justified way of dealing with our grievances with each other.
We've been talking to Greg Tillman. The film is called Oklahoma City Bombing, American Terror. It's coming out April 18th. By the time you hear this, you can watch the trailers over there on Netflix. We talked about Star Trek before and the Klingon. We can't forget to thank Captain Christina Kirk for arranging this interview for us. Okay, but Mr. Tillman, That's right. There anything I haven't asked you real quick, like in the next minute, you want to leave us with?
No, I think the one thing that sometimes doesn't get mentioned in these things is just, you know, sort of the team. You know, it took a huge team of people working on this. I had an amazing team of people. You know, we were teamed up with Original Productions, the guys that do Deadliest Catch, Brian Lovett and Jeff Hassler. And, you know, between them and Netflix and my team of folks that I've worked with on a bunch of stuff, Tiller Russell was a producer on this. I just really, you know, there's no way this happens without a lot of really talented people. So I always want to mention them.
Greg Tillman, thank you so much. I wish we had more time. I got a million questions. I can't recommend this film, Oklahoma City Bombing, American Terror, April 18th on Netflix. Thank you so much.
Hey, thank you, Ed. Appreciate it.
Good night.